okay, this is the one that could easily consume a couple of hours for me, but it's the pain test post about the Ed Startup 101.
Yeah.
And you identify a phrase, right, EdTech reporting sucks, as the pain test, but then you also sort of candidly admit that that's not really a pain point for most people.
No, I mean, and I think that this is, the exercise of writing out these things for this Ed Startup 101 class has been really interesting for me. I mean, it's one of those examples where it's a good reminder that Hack Education is very much it is my personal blog. It is a place where I work out my own ideas, and I do a lot of sort of reflective and reflexive writing there that isn't necessarily, not necessarily EdTech reporting. But I do think about this a lot. I mean, I feel like Hack Education, I want it to be a site that I would want to read. I want to be able to offer, smart analysis and insight and think deeply about what I think is a very important subject. But I don't know if there's sort of this huge unserved market of people who shake their fist at some of the other technology and education publications that are out there right now.
I want to argue against the whole idea that the pain point needs to be a monetizable pain point. So tell me if I'm going the right direction for you.
No, I think, and I would actually even take it one step farther back, which is thinking about, and actually Stephen Downes responded to this piece on his site today saying, do we even need to be thinking about sort of pain in this way? I mean, after all, many innovations are things that people didn't realize that they wanted, right? And you didn't realize until the iPod came along that you needed a digital portable music device. You didn't realize until the iPhone came along that this was something that was, that you were lacking. And so if you just think about things in terms of pain and then entrepreneurialism sort of addressing pain, it's not necessarily innovative, or it's not necessarily sort of, it's a very sort of almost defensive, certainly sort of Band-Aid, a lot of sort of Band-Aid solutions. It doesn't actually get to the root of the problem, and it doesn't necessarily sort of move the conversations to the side and then sort of go around sort of what would be typically seen as sort of challenges and obstacles and frustration. And I fully agree with you about this question of this question of monetizing around pain is that's something we're supposed to address in next week. But I think I spend a lot of time thinking about it, because I look at other technology and education technology publications, particularly ones that are that have optimized what they do for money, and that's definitely I think that's part of the problem that we're at right now, is the way in which the monetization tends to dictate the solution.
I want to make two arguments against it. Yeah, solutions. I want to make two arguments against it. One of which is, if you look at something like the civil rights movement, right, that's true sort of human pain that often has nothing to do with the financial. And I mean, you don't need to look for a revenue source to say, okay, the change needs to happen. And so the pain for me wouldn't be that EdTech reporting sucks. The pain is that there is a disenfranchisement of true value for people because of corporate interests. Yeah. So my first sort of pushback is, okay, so the pain is real, but it's not a pain, this idea of monetizing it, like you said, as an entrepreneurial opportunity doesn't make any sense if the pain is a real human pain. The second is our food analogy. Okay, so bear with me for a second here. So we went to a Thai restaurant the other night. It was this lovely little tiny Thai place. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. There's a commitment to a certain kind of food. They start cooking it, they build up a clientele and customers, and then they're in a relationship with those customers based on doing something that they love and are providing for them, which is very different than sort of like a national chain of food stores that go in and might identify pain as a way of almost sort of manipulating community response and using sort of marketing strategy to get people to come in and spend money, which is so far removed from the act of cooking what you love to an act of looking for financial return, that it was sort of my first response was, okay, to use this pain test, which is not the, I mean, it's not the first time we've heard this, right, from a Tech Startup 101.
Right.
I mean, Khalid Smith has used the same phrase. But is the pain test taking you in a direction away from authentic value and service to thinking about business in terms of revenue, which leads you in a completely different direction?
No, and I think that's precise. I think that sort of precisely gets to some of the struggles that I have, sort of deep, sort of philosophical struggles about whether what I do in hack education, if I can even sort of school it into this model that others are using to sort of think about creating an education startup. Even though, you and I have talked before that there are certainly entrepreneurial aspects of what I do. Certainly that I am, self-employed. This is the way, hack education is part of the way in which, I pay my bills. And yet answering these sorts of questions to me doesn't seem to move things forward in a way that I'm necessarily comfortable with them going. And I don't feel that it's actually even, it feels as though it's sort of the wrong questions. And so once you start answering the wrong questions, you're certainly you're sort of solving a different set of problems.
Well, it's intriguing because if the pain test is sort of a common way of looking at the educational technology market, obviously brought from other entrepreneurial markets, then it carries with it this value set that's more like the chain restaurant than it is like the small, authentic cuisine restaurant. I want to present a situation to you and ask you, if the tables were turned, I'm hoping this will give you a chance to think about your situation. So last night I interviewed Bob Glinner, who's a filmmaker who made a movie called Schools That Change Communities, about place-based education, and it's brilliant. Really fascinating look at a different way of sort of building curriculum in a school. I had 3 people show up for the show. By the end of the show, there were maybe 6 or 7, but the day before, I'd done one on 21st Century Skills, and over 60 people showed up. And I felt terrible for Bob that I had got him out he actually went to a university in order to be able to do the thing, and to have such a terribly small audience. But to me, it felt almost as though the more significant topic draws the lesser audience. And if I were to apply the pain test, I wouldn't be doing the interviews that I think are the most significant.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and I think that this is, I think of the sort of the way in which, particularly around, journalism, but certainly, education technology journalism, the things that probably get the most page views, the things that most people click on, the stories that are likely to appear sort of retweeted on Twitter and posted to multiple Facebook pages and shared around the office, so to speak, are not necessarily the ones that are, I think, the most important. They tend to be, what you just said, the sort of 21st century skill. Here's a list of 10, the 10 21st century skill types of things. Here's that sort of. There's a certain superficiality, I think, that it comes back to the fear of missing out too, that we seem to be cultivating with a lot of our social media and sharing practices.
So if you were to rewrite the Ed Startup 101 curriculum for week 4, What question would you ask instead of the pain test question?
I think that part of the problem with thinking about it, framing it in terms of pain, is that it is in terms of fixing a broken thing. I think of this in sort of medical terms, right? You broke a bone, we're going to fix it. You skinned your knee, we're going to put a Band-Aid on it. You have a fever, take an aspirin, and it doesn't seem to sort of get, as I said earlier, it doesn't seem to sort of get to some of the underlying sort of systemic things that you might not see if you're sort of just looking at it in terms of what you can easily identify as the pain that you can cure.
Brilliant.
So I think that we need to, and I think that we do need to have a different sort of diagnostic tools as we talk about what's wrong. Because I don't think that sort of broken systems or sort of this way in which we can just sort of glance over things. I think that obsession with looking at test scores is a great example of this. I think that we're sort of identifying, if you just look at test scores as the problem, then the solution is sort of more test prep, more time spent studying for the teaching around and studying for the test. And that's, I think you're solving that pain, right? But it's actually the wrong thing altogether.
I think you've done a brilliant job bringing in another analogy, right? So the food one works really well here. I think also medicine works well, right? So there are symptoms and there are causes. So so often, pharmaceutical companies, so sort of a large money is around treating symptoms rather than helping educate on the causes. So there is this sort of interesting pushback here, right, that educational companies that don't have a component of helping to educate the users, then end up being a financial company. So to what degree is it legitimate to say, okay, if you're an educational company, part of your mission ought to and should be educating about what you're doing, knowing that the moment you say that, people will say, well, you're not going to get funding for that.
Well, this is so interesting. This is actually something I didn't write about this week. I ended up tweeting about it, was that there is a certain test prep startup that seems to consistently get stories written about it, even though there's really nothing interesting about it. It's really sort of the old sort of Princeton Review or Kaplan Review book that you would get to study for your SAT exam, but now it's on the iPad. And so the multiple choice tests, instead of you filling them out with a pencil as you practice your vocabulary, now you touch the screen on your iPad. But they have a great PR team, and every time they release a new app or that there's some modicum of difference, all of the tests, but all of the technology companies write about them. And I tweeted saying, like, why are you covering this story? Like, it's not interesting. It's not interesting technology. It's not interesting content, for crying out loud. It's test prep. But I think that it certainly fits into the, that company would fit very neatly into the pain test model. And so I think that we get, I think that when we're thinking about things in that way, we really then can't have a more nuanced conversation, or a conversation that gets to the heart of some of these issues around. And you could say too that, well, testing industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's a monetizable pain. Go for it. It's a great idea for a startup, and yet it's a terrible idea if you want to get to these root causes, I think, that are really underlying the problems that we identify with the way in which teaching and learning and schooling and systems happen.
I think this is a moment of clarity. In the same way that your Audrey test post, sort of brought clarity to a moment, I think this pain test post is a moment of clarity. That this is really the driving kind of mindset behind a lot of the ed tech startups. It's the Silicon Valley venture capital. How are we going to succeed financially? And I think this conversation clarifies the downside to that mentality.
Yep.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good for you.
Yeah, because I think, especially I think, next week when we're supposed to layer on top of this question of monetization, I think it becomes skewed even more. I mean, it's one thing to say, I think it's one thing to sort of identify pain in your life and that move towards addressing that. Sort of taking that out of the business prospect. But once you do add in the money in the markets, I think that it goes even further off.
Okay, so you actually have made it to week 5 of Ed Startup 101.
Yeah, I know, and I really felt this week was it's become clearer and clearer, sort of square peg round hole, that part of the process of this Ed Startup class is that you're supposed to be working on your own education startup. And the more I sort of think through and write through and sit through the class and listen to other people's ideas, the more I realize that what I'm doing at Hack Education doesn't fit that mold. I mean, it doesn't fit the mold that the class is asking us to sort of go through as we think through the pain test, for example, or monetization, business cycles, product cycles, that sort of thing. And so we'll see how much longer I manage to stay interested in the class.
Well, we talked last week a lot about the difference between fast food or mass-produced food and the small restaurant. That's really stuck with me, and I love the comparison.
Yeah. And I think that the post that I wrote was definitely a response. The post that I wrote was a response to our conversations, and really, I think, for a lot of other reasons too, just thinking about what I do, my work, my voice. It's definitely, it doesn't feel as though it's beholden to the same set of, or I don't want it to be beholden to the same set of sort of, whether it's market forces or publishing industry forces or technology industry forces, as some of these other things seem to be. It doesn't even feel like the right question for me to be asking.
So I want to actually do a little vocabulary here, because I think if we phrase this differently, it actually puts it in a different light, and it's still very much a part of making a living. Right? So we used to say about a product or a service, what's the value proposition? But we now say, how are you going to monetize it? And that's a very different, that the framing and the language say two very different things. Right? When you have a value proposition, which is it's like the New Yorker, right? There's no pain point that requires people to go out and buy the New Yorker, but there's a value proposition, which is people like depth of thinking.
Yeah.
So I think that the question itself places you in a position where you say, well, that's not really who I am, but you are providing a value. And value drives the market.
No, I think that that's true. I mean, and I think it's interesting for me to be working through this class and thinking about the way in which the class itself is. I mean, it's not just my own struggles with framing Hack Education this way, but it's the way in which I think the class itself and the larger conversations and narratives about education startups are framing are framing things in a certain way that's going to have certain projects move forward because they fit the model of a monetization. They fit the monetization thing easily, and I think it's harder for people to partially because conversations, as you say, have switched away from value offered to making money. But I think it's harder to fit into this model, at least, some of these other projects that may indeed be ones that get to the core of other, get to the core of problems in education in ways that offering a new app, building a new app, just never, ever, ever will.
I think we're onto something. And I think that the pain test is a very different framing than the value proposition.
Yeah.
And I think that, those of us who care should be supporting individuals and organizations that are providing value. And because we will buy based on value. I don't go into the store based on pain most of the time. I usually go knowing that I'm going to trade for something I value.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll have to write my own set of questions for next week's assignment.
Send this to David Wiley.
I know.
Okay.
Potential for it going further off track is certainly greater.